Dr. Dawling, Chief Justice, President of the District Court, members of the Judiciary, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to this 35th lecture in the series, and I've been asked to chair this particular session, so I'm very much looking forward to that. I am looking forward to it for a number of reasons, not only because this institution, of course, was founded in 1940 by a certain gentleman called Eamon de Valera, who happened to be my grandfather, and I'm also very, very honoured to be asked to chair this session because I think we're all very much looking forward to hearing Dr. Martin Mansergh and his lecture. Before all of that, I want you please to welcome Dr. Meehan, because of course she is the Director and CEO of the Institute of Advanced Studies here. She served as inaugural Director of the Irish Research Council. She was Head of Research and Innovation of Higher Education Authority from 2002 to 2012. She holds a PhD in pharmacology and has a number of postgraduate qualifications in management and finance. She was designated as Science Europe's inaugural Gender Diversity Champion in 2016 to 2017, and in 2017 she was elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Meehan.
Thank you, Chair, for the kind introduction. I just want very briefly to welcome you all here this evening. Chapter Dála, Chief Justice, members of the Judiciary, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege for me to welcome you here this evening on behalf of the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. We're very honoured to host this event, the 35th Hugh Fitzpatrick Lecture, and I want to just take this opportunity briefly to thank you for considering us as a host for this event. In welcoming you all, I would obviously like to in particular welcome our speaker, Dr. Martin Mansergh, and I look forward very much, as I'm sure you do, to his address. What I would like to, and I'm sure you will indulge me in this, to extend a very special warm welcome to our chair this evening, Sheila de Valera, and indeed to the extended de Valera family, who are with us, a number of whom are with us this evening. I think a lot of you in this room actually have more connections, or more knowledge in fact, about the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies than I do, because I'm a very recent addition to the Dublin Institute family. And I think a number of you in the room will understand much better than I the very deep and seminal link that exists between the Institute and the de Valera name, and the reference has been already made to this. I want briefly just to say that from its establishment in 1940 by Eamon de Valera, the Institute has worked very hard to deliver on the vision that he had. The establishment of the Institute was at the time an act of great foresight. And I think we believe, and I'm here this evening, as indeed are a number of other senior professors from the Institute, that we have continued to deliver on his vision for the conduct of advanced studies in theoretical physics, cosmic physics, and Celtic studies. Whether we look at the work of Schrödinger, who obviously was the first professor in the Institute, through to Singh, Bergen, O'Callaghan, and many others of international renown, we have continued to do advanced work right up to the present day. And in that regard, I would encourage you all to have a look at this little leaflet, pardon me, this little leaflet that actually talks about some of the highlights from 2017. So have a look at it and see what it is we're doing today. You will see that the work continues, that our preeminence is still there. We continue to be a bastion and a beacon for fundamental research. We continue to attract international scholars to the Institute. We continue to be a hub nationally for those disciplines in which we conduct research. And we continue to engage as ambassadors for Irish science internationally, particularly in large global endeavours. Somebody mentioned to me downstairs that they don't hear very much about us these days, and I think I can safely say that that will change. You will be hearing more about us in the coming months, because we are doing fantastic work. Finally, in conclusion, I do have a few housekeeping announcements that I need to make. If the fire alarm happens to go off, which I hope obviously it won't, we are to proceed in an orderly fashion down the stairs, and the assembly point is outside just across the road. I look forward very much to hearing the lecture this evening, and again welcome you all very much to the Institute, and hopefully indeed we will be seeing you again at a future point. Thank you very much for your
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Meehan. The next person I'm going to call is the reason why we're all here. Hugh Fitzpatrick, of course, in 2002 established the public biannual series of lectures in legal bibliography, and this is the 35th such lecture. He has been the series founder and organiser. He has practiced as a solicitor for 12 years, and Hugh also taught part-time for 9 years in the Law Library. He's completed his postgraduate qualifications and training as a librarian in Milltown Park. He has degrees at master's level in a number of schools in psychology, in the psychology of human development, in criminology and education. He is a graduate of UCD, of Maynooth, Cambridge, Oxford and Trinity College, Dublin. Can I please call on Hugh Fitzpatrick to speak to us, please?
Dr. Dála, Chief Justice, members of the judiciary, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank Dr. Meehan for her welcome to the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. It is an honour for lecturers in legal bibliography to be permitted to hold tonight's lecture in association with the Institute. And I believe I am right to say on behalf of all of us that we are very grateful to them for their warm and generous hospitality. I would like to endorse the welcome already given by Dr. Meehan to members of the De Valera family present this evening because of their close association with the subject of tonight's lecture. It is also an honour to see Sheila De Valera, granddaughter of Eamon De Valera, in the chair, and my near contemporary in UCD a number of decades ago. It is indeed appropriate for us to be celebrating the 80th year of the Irish Constitution in an institution set up by Eamon De Valera. Each of us has his or her own perspective on Bunracht na hÉireann in practice, lawyer and non-lawyer alike. But what is intriguing about tonight's speaker is his experience of the Northern Ireland peace process, which of course impacted greatly on the course of history and our Constitution. Tonight we look forward to Dr. Mansergh's exploration of the creation of an independent Irish constitutional tradition and Eamon De Valera's role in it. My thanks are due to Martin Mansergh for delivering his contribution. My thanks are also due to the sponsors of tonight's brochure. I don't have one to wave at you, I'm afraid, but you will have received one earlier, I hope. Bloomsbury Professional, Claris Press, Cove Heritage Centre, De Burka Rare Books, and Dr. Mona B. McGarry. You will, of course, find more information on the series in the brochure. Tonight's lecture is part of a series whose subjects have the unifying theme of legal bibliography, and in this respect, it is probably a unique series. To my great pleasure, the series has become so well known that I need to say no more on that. This success is, of course, due to the efforts of the past speakers, and I am glad to see at least 5 of them present in the audience tonight. This brings me back to our speaker, Dr. Martin Mansergh. May I welcome you as 35th speaker to the series. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Hugh. And I now have the great pleasure in introducing Martin Mansergh, who has been a Fianna Fáil Senator, a TD, a Minister of State, a member of the Council of State, political advisor to Charles Haughey, to Albert Reynolds and Bertie Ahern, a negotiator of the Downing Street Declaration and Good Friday Agreement. He is, of course, an historian, an author, a scholar, And Martin combines the academic background through his extensive historical knowledge and research, along with the practical political experience of a skilled negotiator. And we are therefore very fortunate to have Martin here this evening to give us the 35th lecture in the Hugh Fitzpatrick series of lectures. Martin, if you would, please.
Thank you very much.
Chair, Chairman of the Institute, Chief Justice, other members of the Judiciary, Deputy, Chancellor of the National University of Ireland, and other colleagues, former colleagues, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Hugh Fitzpatrick for his invitation to give this lecture in legal bibliography, and the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies for providing a distinguished venue closely associated, as we have heard, with Eamon de Valera, and for their generous hospitality. I would also like to thank his granddaughter, Sheila de Valera, for chairing the lecture, a person with whom I would have had a lot of fruitful interaction, particularly when she was Arts Minister. With her cousin, Eamon O'Keefe, she has carried forward a proud family tradition in national life. And I'd also, like other previous speakers, welcome other members of the de Valera family. I should also acknowledge and thank the brochure sponsors, and since you won't be able to see my footnotes, I would like to thank the many historians and legal experts that I may or may not mention by name, but my debt to their work is obvious and considerable. While I'm not a lawyer, I've always had a strong interest in constitutional law, particularly as it interacts with constitutional politics. When I served in the Department of Foreign Affairs in the second half of the 1970s, I recall needing to consult Charles Lysaght in the Legal Advisor's Office on several occasions, and he wrote an excellent biography of Brendan Bracken, which I've only relatively recently caught up with. And as a political advisor in the Taoiseach's office, I often needed to visit Matt Russell and Marcus de Burke, who happened to be fellow Tipperary men, in the Attorney General's office downstairs in the same wing of government buildings. And I also benefited from the advice of many Attorneys General, all of whom in my observation were close advisors to every Taoiseach, not just every government. As a historian, I am conscious of the leading role played by lawyers in the English, American and French revolutions. And of course, Pádraig Pearse was a trained barrister and possessed many of their forensic skills, even if he only occasionally practiced in a handful of cases involving the defence of Irish language rights. The constitutions of states and many other constitutions of states, acts of parliament, international treaties and many other political decisions and declarations either take a legal form or require to be legally vetted. And when I was a diplomat in Bonn in the mid-1970s, I was impressed by the high number of diplomats in the German Foreign Ministry trained in the law. One of de Valera's most enlightened decisions was to establish the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies in 1940, which could recruit some brilliant minds among European refugees. This institution, formed when the state was very strapped for money, has successfully weathered subsequent periodic economic and financial vicissitudes that have afflicted the state and done much distinguished work. And I vividly recall a visit in the autumn of 2010 to the Dunsink Observatory when I had some responsibility for OPW. One might be allowed a wry smile at a news report of the recent Sinn Féin Ardèche, where Martin Ferris TD was quoted singing the highest praises for the leadership contribution of Gerry Adams and the late Martin McGuinness, and describing them, quote, as two unbelievable people. The layman in matters of science might sometimes be inclined to apply similar words of praise to some brilliant theories and discoveries that are hard to get the mind around, as exemplified by Schrödinger's cat, which apparently, according to the laws of quantum mechanics, can be alive and dead at the same time. Mind you, it was said of an American president of the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, when he died, how can you tell? God be with the days. Politics, too, can suffer from relative incomprehensibility. Many, myself included, are inclined to think of the seamless, frictionless border promised even under a hard Brexit as falling into the category referred to by the Red Queen in Through the Looking Glass when she told the unbelieving Alice to try harder, why sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Alice's creator was, of course, the high-flying mathematician and logician Charles Dodgson, pen name Lewis Carroll. The problem facing De Valera and close Sinn Féin colleagues in the mid-1920s of how to enter the door without taking the oath posed a similar conundrum. I have long come to the conclusion that politics is less the art of the possible and more the art of the seeming impossible. Indeed, there have been some difficult attempted Houdini exercises relating to justice matters in the last few days. Probably every branch of human endeavour is guided by a mixture of near sacrosanct assumptions or articles of faith and empirical observation. My legal text is Article 1 of Bunrat na hÉireann. It reads, "The Irish nation hereby affirms its inalienable, indefeasible and sovereign right to choose its own form of government, to determine its relations with other nations, and to develop its life, political, economic and cultural, in accordance with its own genius and traditions." In the aftermath of the Easter Rising, an American journalist, Joyce Kilmer, published a remarkable interview in the New York Times magazine on the 20th of August 1916 with a member of Cumann Món from Wexford, Moira Regan, who had been in the GPO during Easter week and who subsequently moved to New York. In her testimony, she captured in a few words the essence of the Easter Rising and the independence struggle to follow in terms of purpose. And I quote, and this is what she said: "We have been living in a country that had no national life. And suddenly we were shown that we had a national life, that we were a nation, a persecuted and crushed nation, but nevertheless a nation. We were a province and now we are a nation. We were British subjects and now we are Irish. This is what the rising of Easter week has done for Ireland." The creation of a national life of our own, something that has undoubtedly been achieved over the last 100 years, imperfectly perhaps, was the objective of the revolutionary generation and also a particular objective of Eamon de Valera. I remember a good many years ago a late night discussion in Aberdeen, including Professor Tom Devine, leading Scottish historian, in which it was put to me that the thing many Scots most envied about Ireland was the existence here of a national life. Article 1 is less familiar today than the latterly more contentious Articles 2 and 3, either in their original or their post-1998 reworded form, but it is at least as important. As noted by historian, NUI Galway professor Gerodo Tui, and I quote, "Throughout the whole life of De Valera's public life, the central question, the status of Ireland, the extent of her independence, the exact measure of sovereignty in all its manifold forms, economic, social and cultural, no less than political, this central question was to be the governing passion of his political life. Article 1 is a comprehensive statement of the right of Irish national self-determination as underpinning the sovereign independence of the state. It has to be read in conjunction with Article 5, which states just that Ireland is a sovereign, independent, democratic state, and with Article 6, Section 1, which is a considerable expansion on Article 2 of the Irish Free State Constitution of 1922, and I quote, "All powers of government, legislative, executive and judicial derive under God from the people, whose right it is to designate the rulers of the state, and in final appeal to decide all questions of national policy according to the requirements of the common good." Now one could say that in Article 6, John Charles McQuaid encounters Jean-Jacques Rousseau, including the famous opening line of the social contract, "Man is born free but is everywhere in chains," but persuades himself that it is St. Thomas Aquinas. Irrespective of the sources of its inspiration, it confirmed language largely adopted from the Free State Constitution and its early drafts in which anti-treaty Republicans were involved, but it has an important additional element of direct democracy through referendum as well. Taking the three together, Articles 1, 5 and 6, self-determination in Ireland's case points to national independence, representative democracy, and popular sovereignty. Article 1 of Bunreacht na hÉireann is the first of three articles of the Constitution under the heading "The Nation," which are distinct from Articles 4 to 11 headed "The State." The nation-state distinction was queried by J.J. McGilligot, Secretary of the Department of Finance, occupying a position paid to be sceptical of all extravagant projects, including constitutions, which might have knock-on consequences for public expenditure. The distinction reflected the reality of partition, but came to play an important role in the constitutional accommodation of the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Continues to do so to this day, for example, in relation to EU citizenship rights of Irish citizens resident in Northern Ireland post-Brexit. And Northern Ireland will be the only part of the UK where the residents will continue, provided they're willing to be Irish citizens or to take it up, they will also have rights of EU citizenship. In the Europe of the 1920s and 1930s, there were many alternative forms of government available across Europe, notably dictatorships, which critics of the Constitution claimed it was capable of producing via the office of the presidency. And another alternative was a corporatist system, which appeared to have papal approval in Italy, and which was ostensibly used to construct a new Seanad that only had weak powers, but in reality only lip service was being shown. The real alter ego was the 1922 Free State Constitution, circumscribed by and subordinate to the treaty, deriving its validity not just from the Dáil but from a British Act of Parliament. The drawing up of a draft constitution in the spring of 1922, in which both the pro-treaty and anti-treaty sides were heavily involved, was, as Sean McBride emphasised to me in the mid-1980s, an attempt to avert civil war by producing a Republican document that would largely ignore the treaty. And he gave me a copy of a lengthy article on the subject from the journal Era Ireland in 1970. Collins and De Valera consulted closely on the draft constitution before it was taken to London, and it was an important part of the basis of the short-lived Collins-De Valera Pact leading up to the June 1922 general election. The essence of the draft, beginning in Article 1, was a strong assertion of the nation's sovereignty, with no mention of either the king or the oath. It was vetoed by the British, who rewrote or inserted several articles themselves. Following this, Article 1 of the Free State Constitution now read, quote, "The Irish Free State, otherwise hereinafter called or sometimes called Saoirseach Éireann, is a co-equal member of the community of nations forming the British Commonwealth of Nations." From a British perspective, the status granted Ireland by the treaty was neither sovereign nor independent, nor based on the principles of self-determination, nor even unqualified consent. In 1921, according to them, what was being conferred on Ireland was Dominion Home Rule. One might regard this as a contradiction in terms, but no doubt it was intended to blur the switch from devolution or Home Rule to limited independence in a context where the sovereignty of the dominions in law, especially with regard to foreign policy and defence, was still evolving and not then fully recognised. There was a concern not to create any precedents which would assist other dominions to loosen their ties to the mother country. The intention was to keep Ireland spancelled, or as the British legal advisor Lionel Curtis characterised the Foreign Office attitude, I quote, "to be content to run like good dogs after the British coach." The net point is that both before and after the Irish Free State came into being on the 6th of December 1922, the extent of its independence as well as its basis remained contested. To evaluate in context the contribution and achievement of the founders of the state, including de Valera, it is necessary to go back. It could be said that this state has a very diverse parentage, or to use another metaphor, there were a lot of building blocks. The Gaelic revival, a prime motor of the Irish Revolution, looked back to the historic Irish nation before the Battle of Kinsale and the flight of the Earls, and to the notion of gaining independence with continental hope. What is less often referred to, but which was just as important, was the substantial fusion of the two nations of medieval Ireland into a single Irish nation based on their common Catholic faith, manifested most obviously in the Catholic Confederation of the 1640s. Later, after final complete military defeat in 1690-91, Jacobitism, the Wild East and the Hidden Ireland kept alive the religious and cultural traditions of the people, even though much of them went underground. A patriot tradition also grew out of the Protestant elite, dissatisfied with their political and economic subordination and inspired across the 18th century Atlantic world by their bold American cousins. Grattan's Parliament left a legacy of volunteering as a means of influencing or intimidating Parliament, taken up by both Ulster and Irish volunteers in 1913, creating forces and a paramilitary tradition that had, as a result, a partitioned Ireland, one part independent, the other a devolved region of the UK, and then much later on to a resumed and prolonged Northern Ireland conflict. From the late 18th century came the dictum, "England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity." We are less familiar with the obverse, enunciated by a future Irish Chief Secretary under Lord Palmerston, Edward Horseman, that, and I quote, "Ireland's calamity was England's opportunity," referring both to the 1798 rebellion and the Act of Union and the effects of the famine. The main beacon from the period was the ringing of a fleeting legislative independence confirmed by the British 1783 Renunciation Act for Grattan's Parliament, and which was abolished forever by the Act of Union, but the restoration of which was sought from O'Connell's repeal movement to Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin. Fascinatingly, the advice of Lionel Curtis, who was to become secretary to the British Post-Treaty Irish Committee, was to make sure that the treaty involved Amendment 2, not repeal of the Act of Union, as otherwise the legal position would revert to that of the British Renunciation Act of 1783. And that would unbar the road to a republic, and horror of horrors, the Irish could then write their own constitution instead of having it conferred on them by Britain. Indeed, in Curtis's opinion, the Irish wanted their own constitution even more than they wanted a republic. For Curtis, it was the imperial parliament, not the Irish people and not the Dáil, that legitimised the Free State and its constitution, regardless of the statement in its Article 2 that all powers of government are derived from the people. The Free State Constitution was attached as a schedule to an act that stated that any provision or enactment contrary to the treaty would be void and inoperable. As one of the commentaries by Irish constitutional lawyer and Irish Party MP for 30 years representing Donegal South, J.G. Swift McNeill, KC, who lectured in UCD, put it, essentially agreeing with Curtis, the Dáil, unlike Grattan's Parliament, did not enjoy sovereign independence, but as against that, it had the inestimable advantage of having government dependent on it and accountable to it. Between 1782 and 1800, there was no right of appeal to the Privy Council in London. Swift McNeill also pointed out that in the treaty there was no claim to the independent control of foreign affairs. While Britain made much in general of the claim that membership of the British Commonwealth was free and voluntary, this, as we know, was not the case in respect of Ireland. The pedantry of Curtis was very in the face, with Article 51, for example, declaring that the executive authority of the Irish Free State is hereby declared to be vested in the King. The wording of the oath, too, was stitched into Article 17. Curtis had, of course, earlier insisted that the treaty had to be ratified not by the Dáil, but by the Parliament of Southern Ireland, created under the Government of Ireland Act 1920. One of his truly bizarre proposals, made redundant by the course of events, was that if there were any question of De Valera participating in the provisional government, given that he was born in America and therefore an alien in Ireland, quote, it may be necessary to give him the status of a British subject by statute. Curtis was also the person most responsible for the outcome and for the management of the suppressed Boundary Commission report in 1925. From an Irish perspective, the limitations of the treaty were not denied, but there was a determination by successive governments to eliminate them progressively until full sovereignty and independence was achieved, preferably along with unity. This was broadly the Collins stepping stone theory, which worked, provided sometimes stiff British resistance and retaliation could be overcome, but it had no successful application to Northern Ireland. In late 1925, Jerry Boland, who favoured Dáil participation if the oath could be removed, said at a party meeting that he wanted a republic that will work and conceded, and I quote, there might be a stepping stone. He added that he was as entitled to speak for the dead as anyone, in an allusion to his brother Harry, killed at the beginning of the Civil War. It is not necessary for tonight's purposes to rehearse in detail the history of the separatist idea, beginning with the initially reformist United Irishmen, through to Tone, Emmett, Davis, the Young Ireland movement, and on to the Fenians, all of whom kept alive the model of an independent state on the French and American models. And if one thinks what perhaps we have from the French and American influence, well, from the French we clearly have the tricolour flag brought home in 1848, and in the Constitution the Dáil is described as the House of Representatives, and that seems to be American influence. For Emmett, the essence of independence was Ireland taking its place among the nations of the earth. a more realistic definition today of sovereignty than notions of absolute and indefeasible sovereignty. Thomas Davis stressed the importance of European allies, but also indicated his preference for a conservative republicanism. In other words, a parliamentary and a constitutional one, not the type of republicanism that rushed to the barricades and massacred innocents. Despite the best efforts of most of these forces, the prospect of unity between the different communities in Ireland, which had initially been quite hopeful, faded and divisions widened. The mainstream of Irish political life, from O'Connell through Butt, Parnell and Redmond, was parliamentary combined with some extra-parliamentary agitation. From time to time, they were able to assert considerable influence on British political life when they held the balance of power. One of their biggest services to British and Irish democracy being to help the Liberal government to get rid of the veto of the House of Lords. An Irish parliamentary tradition was firmly established, so that it was natural for the 1916 leaders to envisage and to express in the proclamation the desire to hand power over to a democratically elected parliament. Incidentally, a history of the foot soldiers of the Irish Parliamentary Party in the early 20th century shows quite clearly that we are wrong to blame what we call clientelism on the PR system. Irish MPs drove the Imperial Parliament insane by constant questions on parochial issues such as roads, piers, flood drainage of agricultural land, land purchase, and post-1909 eligibility for old age pensions. When birth registration in the 1840s and previously had been an imperfect science. John O'Mara, Irish Party MP for Kilkenny South 1907, later elected for Sinn Féin in 1918, was once urged by one of his close supporters, a priest, to put down a parliamentary question about a woman who had a complaint about the trespass of a neighbour's cow on her land. In these days, today, when democracy is being put in question in several countries by voters who feel neglected by and alienated from distant and detached elites, maybe there is something to be said for a tradition before and after independence that keeps public representatives close to their constituents. One of the major achievements of the Irish Revolution was to win a mandate for the aim of independence in line with the ideals of 1916, anchored in the framework of a parliamentary democratic system. In the autocracy of Tsarist Russia, parliamentary roots were much shallower, and it was easy for Lenin to brush Parliament aside when he could not commandeer a majority. Significantly, Russia is not commemorating the centenary of the October Revolution. And President Putin has said that gradual development would have served Russia better than the 1917 upheaval with, and I quote, its ruins of statehood and the ruthless destruction of millions of human lives. No similar conclusion that the cost of independence was too great or was avoidable has been generally accepted here. Despite growing up in his uncle's newly built agricultural labourer's cottage outside Brewery, De Valera's American birth and his mother's remaining in the United States gave him wider horizons, options, and ambitions. Prior to 1914, he was both a Gaelic leaguer, but only after he met his wife, and a Home Ruler who believed, not unreasonably, when he joined the volunteers, that Home Rule would not be obtained peacefully, but would have to be fought for. While he went with the minority in September 1914, he did not initially see the necessity of a split. He was not involved in secret organisations prior to the Rising and only briefly afterwards, nor part of the planning for it. In terms of military results, he acquitted himself well, but even with his low political profile, was lucky to be just beyond the cut-off point of the executions. His insistence in an English prison that respect should be shown the former volunteer chief Owen McNeill suggests that he could understand, even if he did not necessarily agree with, the calling off of the rising. It was De Valera who took up the political baton of 1916 and who led a united movement that secured an overwhelming democratic mandate outside northeast Ulster for independence in December 1918. Further external support at foreign state level was to be in short supply. Up to the end of the war, Collins and Griffith had continued to hope for a victory of the Central Powers to secure Ireland a place at the peace table. This may have been naive. An Irish brigade had not been raised amongst British prisoners of war in Germany as the quid pro quo for recognition. German war aims published in late 1916 and early 1917 made no mention of Ireland. If Britain had sought peace terms, there is no guarantee that Irish independence would have ranked high or even at all amongst German negotiating priorities. And as was the case with Napoleonic France, a new European order that did not respect the integrity of national borders or neutrality, and that sought large territorial expansion, would not necessarily suit the interests of a newly emerging small country, and De Valera expressed these sentiments in his famous broadcast reply to Churchill at the end of World War II. In June 1917, soon after release from prison, Eamon De Valera, Thomas Ashe and Desmond Fitzgerald, together with 17 other senior officers, sent an address to the President and Congress of the United States, picking up on objectives set out in a public letter from President Woodrow Wilson to Kerensky in Russia, in which the President said, "We are fighting for the liberty, self-government and undictated development of all peoples." The officers drew his and Congress's attention to Ireland and concluded their address by stating that their purpose was, quote, to secure the complete liberation of the Irish nation. It is worth pausing a moment to consider the development of ideas of political freedom to this point. Magna Carta, imposed on King John by his barons, being advised in his negotiations by William Marshall of this lordship, put limits on arbitrary rule, detention without trial and confiscation, and posited basic rights, including the germs of habeas corpus and trial by jury, essentially for themselves. A copy is preserved in the US Library of Congress, and as far as I know, its Irish version has never been entirely removed from the Irish statute book. This was reinforced by the Bill of Rights at the accession of William and Mary during the Glorious Revolution of 1989. A description echoed by British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson recently when he promised a glorious Brexit. The political philosopher of the Glorious Revolution, John Locke, was the first to develop properly the principle of consent. Civil society was formed by consent and could only operate on the basis of majority consent. A conquered people, and he here principally had in mind the English people since the Norman conquest, had the right to shake off, quote, the yoke of a government by constraint till their rulers put them under such a frame of government as they willingly and of choice consent to. Whether Ireland was, as is still debated, a subordinate kingdom or a colony or both, it was certainly conquered and comprehensively in the 17th century, whatever about earlier. Lloyd George, in preliminary correspondence prior to the treaty negotiations, made clear his reservations about a too free interpretation of this principle. He wrote to De Valera from Inverness on the 7th of September 1921, and I quote, The principle of government by the consent of the government is the foundation of British constitutional development, but we cannot accept as a basis of practical conference an interpretation of that principle which would commit us to any demands which you might present, even to the extent of setting up a republic and repudiating the crown. As early as August 1921, in private Dáil session, De Valera made it clear that he had neither the power nor the inclination to use force against Unionists in the 6 counties, which would be, he argued, to make the same mistake as England had made with Ireland. And shortly afterwards, in a letter to Lloyd George, he wrote, "We do not contemplate the use of force." It could be argued that subsequently he accepted the principle of consent de facto, but not de jure. The Civil War arguably ran counter to the principle of consent, but at its conclusion, De Valera was emphatic that decisions by a majority vote must be submitted to. The 1937 Constitution ensured that many major international decisions, such as entering the EEC and endorsing its later development as the EU, and the Good Friday Agreement, as well as many socio-moral issues relating to marriage and abortion, were and will be directly decided by the people, giving such decisions greater strength and legitimacy. Post-Civil War, he was very clear that any policy he pursued must avoid reigniting the Civil War, attacking Northern Ireland, or renewed conflict with Britain, as the people emphatically did not want any of those things. And whatever about theoretical rights, in practice, progress had to be on strictly constitutional lines. Sovereignty was a concept originally developed by a lawyer, Jean Baudin, in 1576, in the last years of the Valois monarchy, in a book called The Republic, meaning simply the public realm. Absolute monarchy is associated with Louis XIV and with something he never said, l'état c'est moi. His successor, Louis XV, under constant challenge from the magistrates of his parlements or higher law courts, in a famous speech of 1766 that acquired the nickname of the flagellation, read out on his behalf by a councillor of state and member of a famous law family, Joly de Fleury, declared effectively that the executive, legislative and judicial power belonged to him alone, without dependence or sharing it with anyone else, and that the rights and interests of the nation were necessarily united in him. Obviously, despite the influence of Madame de Pompadour, he had not read or accepted Montesquieu. This absolute and indefeasible sovereignty was transferred at the French Revolution. And Article 3 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens of 26th of August 1789 states, "The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body, no individual can exercise authority which does not emanate expressly from it." Ireland has never been able to match the Declaration of 1792 that the French Republic is one and indivisible. The origin of the doctrine of national self-determination is to be found in the deliberations of the French National Assembly in 1790, and in particular the contributions of a lawyer, Merlin de Douai. The issue was the decision of representatives from Alsace to adhere to the new order. Leaving aside previous treaties made by hereditary owners, and I now quote, "The people of Alsace had joined the French people because they wished it. It is solely its will which has consummated and legitimated the union." One can contrast this with the Act of Union of 1800. In the Assembly, a sharp distinction was drawn with an attempt by a section of the nation, say in Brittany or Burgundy, to secede, which could only happen by common consent given the long national investment in them. And all this is quite interesting, particularly in relation to current developments in Catalonia and Spain. The key to success of the Irish independence struggle was that politically, under the leadership of Eamon de Valera, that it aligned itself with aims for the post-war world and championship of small nations articulated by President Wilson, even if Wilson rejected Ireland's eligibility to benefit from this. There is a case for saying that Wilsonian influence coloured de Valera's outlook throughout his life, and there are some quotations to support it. The end of the First World War became the heyday of the nation state. And it is a moot point whether, if Ireland had missed this juncture and failed to stake its claim, it would ever have made it. Actual success fell well short of what was hoped for, but was enough to allow completion of the job as far as the 26 counties were concerned. De Valera later freely acknowledged the amount of progress made in the 1920s by the Cosgrave-led Cumann Nail government. And indeed, it was precisely the progress underway in consolidating the Irish Free State that made it imperative for Fianna Fáil to enter the Dáil. Albert Reynolds, as Taoiseach, once praised W.T. Cosgrave for forcing the issue in the wake of the Kevin O'Higgins assassination 90 years ago in 1927. Cosgrave also deserves credit for the peaceful transfer of power in 1932. There was administrative continuity, as indeed there had been following the handover in 1922 from the British to the Irish, with the exception of policing. The Department of Finance continued for some decades to operate on best Gladstonian principles. It is not just ironic, but instructive, that de Valera's principal collaborator in drafting the Constitution, John Hearn, had been a strong Redmondite in 1918, and that in 1937, de Valera's Attorney General, Patrick Lynch, had been his Irish party opponent in the 1917 Clare by-election. The limitations of the treaty were progressively dismantled, but the coping stone was the 1937 Constitution, which removed any arguments of legitimacy for the IRA. Having based his approach to Britain's need for defence assurances on the commitment not to allow Ireland to be used as a base by Britain's enemies, first controversially enunciated in America in 1920, and having negotiated the return of the ports in 1938, neutrality was under some pressure, but operated quite pragmatically beneath the surface maintained during the war, albeit at the price of some diplomatic isolation afterwards and a strengthening of the position of Northern Ireland in the UK. The Declaration of the Republic in 1949, and that was by the Costello government and inter-party government, and departure from the Commonwealth marked the end of the process, though a common currency was shared for another 30 years, and the common travel area was substituted for Commonwealth privileges, with neither Britain nor Ireland being a foreign country, or having a foreign country as opposed to a separate country status. Economic and cultural self-determination was certainly tried with mixed results, with a more open approach being adopted from the 1960s. National independence means we are not bound by the UK decision on Brexit and are free to head in a different direction. We have operated well as a democracy, with constitutional republicanism now embraced by virtually all. There is, to a varying degree, political instability in many partner countries inside and outside the EU. So far, here at least, and just about, as today's events show, the centre still holds. Apart from losing control of the situation in 1922, the skills and achievements of Eamon de Valera in leading the struggle for independence and state building were considerable, without diminishing the role and contributions of others. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin, for that very learned address. Martin has demonstrated how the Constitution expresses our will as a people to be sovereign, and from the late 18th century there maintained a vision in Irish life to create a national government in the form of a republic. And it's interesting to note that while physical force created the opportunity for separatism and freedom, it was the Irish parliamentary tradition which cemented our democratic system. And Martin has demonstrated this by showing how the roots of constitutional democratic politics lay in the movements of O'Connell and Parnell, and how this parliamentary tradition consolidated democracy through rooted institutions legitimised by the direct wishes and decisions of the Irish people. I now ask for questions. As you know, there isn't a mic at this side, nor is there one for the audience, so if anyone please wants to ask a question, please indicate that to me, and if you would give your name and speak loudly so we can all hear your contribution. Thank you. Who'll be first? There must be someone who'll break the ice. Yes, please, this gentleman.
Little Hugh is my name. I'd like to make a point which I think has some relevance to Brexit and the acknowledged failure of the UK to understand the European community, the European Union in the time of their joining. I think it's because they have never had the experience which we have of being a country subject to a constitution with a classic framework where there is a very detailed description of the institutions and final decisions, if necessary, taken by a Supreme Court, which is in fact the model of the EU treaties, if you like, and is very much in the French and continental tradition. So I think that is one of the great things we've had in the 1937 Constitution, that we have a constitution which enabled us immediately to understand and appreciate the structure of the European community institutions and not to have any worries at all about the existence of a European court. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I suppose there must be one of the few countries in the world not to have a written constitution at this stage, and certainly the use of referendum has been very haphazard and hasn't worked well, whereas here it's well incorporated. People know what to expect of it, they know how it operates, and it's part of the system. Of course, the other factor is that England, in theory anyway, has not been conquered since 1066, whereas most other countries and European countries, within the last couple of generations, most of them have experienced that. But sometimes things are misrepresented. I mean, for example, that they never understood that the EEC treaties, that there was a political dimension to them. They understood it perfectly well. I was reading recently Margaret Thatcher's speech, and she was very pro-EEC in 1975. She perfectly understood that it had a political purpose, and she also understood that it was very necessary to prevent the appalling wars that had existed previously. And she took the view then, which is also true now, that the risks haven't all gone away.
Thank you, Martin. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Martin, first of all, a fine paper, thank you very much indeed. When you're talking about the constitution and tradition, you didn't mention anything. Well, what we got was quite a conservative constitution, yet there have been very radical elements in the old constitution which Mr. de Valera supported in the 1920s and sought to use, like the referendum and initiative, especially that. Was he tempted in any way to introduce any, or to, how did he feel about these particular elements, which he found very useful in the 1920s, but never incorporated into the Constitution?
Thank you.
Well, I suppose I was focusing mainly on Article 1 of the Constitution. I'm aware that there are sort of pluses and minuses between 1922 and 1937, and you know, I accept your point that some positive progressive things were not reincorporated, but nonetheless a lot was, and I think, you see, the great thing about the Constitution is, and this was kind of written into it from the beginning, is that it would be constructively interpreted as time would go by. Even they realized in the 1930s that the ethos of the 1930s was not going to survive for all time, that it would change and it would develop and it would evolve. At the same time, you know, not too many, I think one of the criticisms of the 1922 Constitution, you know, the following 15 years is that it was constantly being changed, and therefore it didn't really have the status that it should have as something, and like the American Constitution has, is that something that you tamper with sparingly and relatively infrequently.
Anyone else? Yes.
Dr. Mansergh, Patricia McNamara, thank you for a very interesting talk. That last question from Dr. Manning leads me on to what I was going to ask you. With, at the moment, we seem to be proposing to change the Constitution nearly every year. What's your opinion about the Citizens' Assembly and all of this kind of conveyor belt of changes that it seems that are being put now to the people, perhaps that we should change? Or should the Constitution be something that we shouldn't really go near unless there's an absolute necessity for it?
I suppose I've mixed feelings. I suppose as a matter of general principle, and this would have been why I supported social partnership in the past, is, you know, participation. I mean, I don't see Parliament as having a monopoly on public affairs. That you know, there should be other bodies. At the same time, it sometimes seems to me that the Citizens' Assembly is, they are not, obviously they may be representative in a sampling sense, but they don't have to go back to anyone to be accountable to them. They represent really only themselves. And I think sometimes maybe it's a device for getting experts and the like to put across the line, getting the Citizens' Assembly to endorse it so that the result will have an influence, put pressure on the Dáil to go in the same direction. So I've mixed feelings about it.
Excuse me. Yes.
Good evening, Karen. It was lovely to be here. Great talk. Just one question: is the Dáil not an elected citizens' assembly? Is the Dáil not an elected citizens' assembly?
Elected assembly?
No, elected citizens' assembly.
Yeah, of course it is, yes. And what's more, the Dáil deputies are accountable.
Yes.
And you see what happened, say, in the last few days, I just make one tangential comment, is that no decisions were made until after the weekend. And I have seen ever so many leaders wanting, you know, their deputies who are getting very excited about things to go home and talk to their constituents and come back. And certainly the one message to come through very, very clearly was that practically nobody, apart from a few aficionados, wanted an election at this time, and that came through loud and clear.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Anthony Jordan. I'd just like to make the point that W.T. Cosgrave's government spent 10 long years at odds with the British government trying to enlarge on what the treaty gave them. And the Constitution, Valera's Constitution is a fine document and he deserves great credit for it. But I suppose the major defect in it, if you could call it a defect, and it was the main point that John A. Costello made about it, was its treatment of women. And I regard that as a generational failure to bring forward the rights of women more. And I think that is still with us in a very clear way.
Well, I won't comment about the present situation. I mean, undoubtedly, I think it was a grave disappointment that, you know, the political equality of women was promised in the 1916 proclamation and was delivered, but it stopped dead at that. You know, whether it was acting on juries, resigning on marriage, and so on. But I think there was a syndrome at work there, and it was what one might always call a vicious circle. There were quite a number of women involved in the revolution, including in the Dáil and political councils and so on. But they were by and large excluded from access to real decision making. I mean, there was no woman, for example, on the treaty delegation to London. Now, if you were on the outside, it doesn't matter whether you're a woman or whether you're any other sort of class person, inevitably you tend to fall back on principle in judging things. Whereas if you're in a negotiation, you obviously you take a more pragmatic, or tend to take a more pragmatic view in that you see close up, you know, the difficulties and complications of things. And I think because they were kept on the outside, not all women, but the most women took the anti-treaty side, and then of course that reinforced the view among conservative politicians. And I don't want to badmouth W.T. Cosgrave, which I respect, but it is recorded that when he went down to Tipperary in about 1923, and there were some women heckling him from the back of the crowd, he told them to go back to their rosary beads and knitting needles. But yeah, I mean, and yes, of course, women in our democracy still have a way to go. If you look at, say, the figures, I mean, they've improved a lot. But you see, if you look at the middle years of the century, I mean, there were practically no women TDs, maybe two or three, mostly widows or sisters or something of male departed deputies. I do remember there was one famous woman public servant called Hector de Beer, who chaired the first Commission on the Status of Women. And I remember a former colleague of mine, the Horrigo Hanrahan, sort of metaphorically mopping his brow, sort of, you know, what a terrible, formidable woman she was, you know.
Well, certainly as someone who had the opportunity as a woman to take part in national politics for nearly 30 years, yes, it was pretty lonely there for many years. It's improving, but the only thing is, when we're talking about the Constitution, it can be seen as a product of its time as well, but at the same time, we all know that there is the provision for change, and that change cannot be just made by government, but much more importantly, by the people. So it comes back to what you were saying earlier, Martin, where when change is needed, there is that mechanism for change.
I was asked to do a chapter for a book on the 150th anniversary of the birth of W.B. Yeats, and I will ask you the article on Senator Michael B. Yeats, who was here at the Chantois, but he was very, very strong on the subject of equal pay. And when he went out to the European Parliament, you know, he positively harassed Irish representatives, and of course people like the Federation of Irish Industry, you know, pointed out all the economic drawbacks of equal pay for women, and you know, yes, but you know, not for some considerable time yet. And I mean, Europe was a very, very good influence, I think, in getting us to become much more progressive on those sort of matters.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Charles Lyson. Compliment to be mentioned by you, you know, go back a long way. But it's a very interesting and outstanding address you've given us in this, for this series. Your appreciation of course, Mr. De Valera, the giant at your shoulder, I think, of the broadcast you gave of undoubtedly justified.
I've read a bit more since.
As Colin Cruz O'Brien once said, a strange one should quote him, but when Mr. De Valera died, he said, as someone said about Burke, you were only to shelter for a moment from a shower of rain to realize you were in the presence of a great man. Colin Cruz O'Brien. I don't know if he's someone you would want quoted. But the interesting thing, could I ask you about, if you'd like to elaborate, the interesting thing about De Valera was his great respect for British legality, that he managed to develop the settlement of 1921 to the Constitution without making any break in what the British would regard as the legal, what was in the legal structures of the settlement of 21.
Well, I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
You know, say the judicial committee of the Privy Council, I think, decided in 1935 that things like the abolition of the oath were not actually contrary to law or contrary to the Statute of Westminster. But of course, there were people like Churchill who persisted in thinking right into the Second World War is, well, regardless of what anybody says, the treaty takes precedence over the Constitution, and Ireland isn't really an independent sovereign state.
And the extraordinary thing was, a group in the Privy Council, of whom you would have thought were high Tories, came to that extraordinary decision, was the fishing case. But there was another thing you might like to comment. There was, one of the steps involved the marriage of an American divorcee to a member of the royal family. So perhaps you'd like to elaborate on how Mr. De Valera used that to good advantage in moving towards the Constitution.
Well, I mean, he used it to, I mean, at a stage where an embarrassed British government was having to sort of seek consent from the Dominions to accept, because you see, in theory, Edward VIII was King of Ireland, King of Australia, King of Canada, etc. And they had to go round in an embarrassed way seeking consent of everybody, including De Valera. And of course, De Valera used it right. Well, this is where we get the king out of the Constitution. And he was left in a residual role, you know, as an organ for the appointment of, you know, foreigners, of Irish ambassadors abroad. And George VI is once supposed to have said he didn't like being described as an organ.
Yes.
Danger O'Connor, Professor here. I'm just wondering if there are any direct, is there any direct evidence of De Valera's interest in mathematics in the Constitution?
What, you mean in politics? With the Constitution. You need to ask somebody who's more expert in mathematics. But do you know that late night television program, the Week in Politics, used to start off with a kind of background sort of Collins expressing frustration about people who would sort of describe political problems of sort of lines and circles on pages. But I mean, it's clear that Dev was, you see, he nearly got the chair of, I think it was mathematical physics at UCC in 1913. And of course, among the credentials he had to put forward was that he was a good Redmondite. All these people on his behalf, which was probably true enough at the time. You know, he was somebody who was sort of very precise with words, and I mean, very fully engaged in the draft. I mean, he didn't just leave the drafting of the Constitution to somebody else, to a lawyer. I mean, he was heavily personally engaged in that himself, and you know, there's an excellent book on John Hearn and the putting together of the Constitution, and how it happened and came together. But I suppose if anybody was to ask, I mean, what was his sort of single biggest legacy, probably the Constitution would be it.
Great, well thank you all very much indeed, and we're lucky enough to be able to go down now to a wine reception, so if you have any more questions, I know Martin will be able to please answer them. Thank you all very much.
Before you all rush off to the glass of wine, and I promise I won't keep you for long, it would be a very dangerous thing to do, to stop you going for your glass of wine. I just want to make a couple of small presentations to the organiser of tonight's event, to Hugh, to our chair, and to our speaker, if I may, just before we release you. So Hugh, can I just ask you maybe to come and I'll just present you with...
This has never happened to me before.
Does that mean you want to come back? A medal, a special edition medal that was actually produced for the centenary of Sir William Rowan Hamilton's anniversary. So, okay.
I'll add that to my collection.
Okay, good.
I'll just do one more for me.
Okay, thank you. You're very welcome. Thank you. It's a memento of Dias, so delighted to have you.
Very special. Thank you very much.
And finally, our guest speaker this evening, Martin, if I may bring your comments. Keeping with the theme of the evening, we have a number of law publications, and in that unashamed marketing, I am going to say that we publish these books and we do the research, and there are a number of them available downstairs if anyone wants to do any Christmas shopping. But I hope you'll find these of interest. They are guides to early Irish law, and the second one is Early Irish Farm and Various Academy.